Darby's translation 1890. Mark 8. In those days, there being again a great crowd, and they having nothing that they could eat, having called his disciples to him, he says to them, I have compassion on the crowd, because they have stayed with me already 3 days, and they have not anything they can eat, and if I should dismiss them to their home fasting, they will faint on the way, for some of them are come from far. And his disciples answered him, Whence shall one be able to satisfy these with bread here in a desert place? And he asked them, How many loaves have ye? And they said, 7. And he commanded the crowd to sit down on the ground. And having taken the 7 loaves, he gave thanks, and broke them and gave them to his disciples, that they might set them before them, and they set them before the crowd. And they had a few small fishes, and having blessed them, he desired these also to be set before them. And they ate and were satisfied. And they took up of fragments that remained 7 baskets. And they that had eaten were about 4,000, and he sent them away. And immediately going on board ship with his disciples, he came into the parts of Dalmanutha. And the Pharisees went out and began to dispute against him, seeking from him a sign from heaven, tempting him. And groaning in his spirit, he says, Why does this generation seek a sign? Verily I say unto you, a sign shall in no wise be given to this generation. And he left them, and going again on board ship, went away to the other side. And they forgot to take bread, and save 1 loaf, they had not any with them in the ship. And he charged them, saying, Take heed, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and of the leaven of Herod. And they reasoned with one another, saying, It is because we have no bread. And Jesus knowing it, says to them, Why reason ye because ye have no bread? Do ye not yet perceive nor understand? Have ye your heart yet hardened? Having eyes, see ye not? And having ears, hear ye not? And do ye not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many handbaskets full of fragments took ye up? They say to him, 12. And when the 7 for the 4,000, the filling of how many baskets of fragments took ye up? And they said, 7. And he said to them, How do ye not yet understand? And he comes to Bethsaida, and they bring him a blind man, and beseech him that he might touch him. And taking hold of the hand of the blind man he led him forth out of the village, and having spit upon his eyes, he laid his hands upon him, and asked him if he beheld anything. And having looked up, he said, I behold men, for I see them, as trees, walking. Then he laid his hands again upon his eyes, and he saw distinctly, and was restored, and saw all things clearly. And he sent him to his house, saying, Neither enter into the village, nor tell it to any one in the village. And Jesus went forth and his disciples, into the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And by the way he asked his disciples, saying unto them, Who do men say that I am? And they answered him, saying, John the Baptist, and others, Elias, but others, one of the prophets. And he asked them, But ye, who do ye say that I am? And Peter answering says to him, Thou art the Christ. And he charged them straitly, in order that they should tell no man about him. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, and be rejected of the elders and of the chief priests and of the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he spoke the thing openly. And Peter, taking him to him, began to rebuke him. But he, turning round and seeing his disciples, rebuked Peter, saying, Get away behind me, Satan, for thy mind is not on the things that are of God, but on the things that are of men. And having called the crowd with his disciples, he said to them, Whoever desires to come after me, let him deny himself, and take up his cross and follow me. For whosoever shall desire to save his life shall lose it, but whosoever shall lose his life for my sake and the gospel shall save it. For what shall it profit a man if he gain the whole world and suffer the loss of his soul? For what should a man give in exchange for his soul? For whosoever shall be ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him shall the Son of Man also be ashamed when he shall come in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. Mark 8. By F. B. Hole. When the 5,000 were fed, as recorded in Mark 6, the disciples took the initiative by calling their master's attention to the needy condition of the crowd. On this second occasion the Lord took the initiative, and drew his disciples' attention to their need, expressing his compassion and concern on their behalf. As on the first occasion, so again now the disciples have simply man before them, and think only of his powers which are wholly unequal to the situation. They had not yet learned to measure the difficulty by the power of their Lord. Hence the instruction which was conveyed by the feeding of a huge crowd with earthly resources of the tiniest order, was repeated. There were slight differences, both as to the number of the people and the number of the loaves and fishes used, but in all the essentials this miracle was a repetition of the other, as once more he fulfilled Psalm 132 verse 15, and displayed the power of God before their eyes. Having fed the multitude, he dismissed them himself, and immediately after departed with his disciples to the other side of the lake, just as on the previous occasion. On his arrival certain Pharisees came with aggressive intent requesting a sign from heaven. He had as a matter of fact just been giving very striking signs from heaven in the presence of thousands of witnesses. The Pharisees had no intention of following him, and hence had not been present so as to see the sign for themselves, still there was ample witness to it if they cared to listen. The fact was of course that on the one hand they had no desire to witness any sign that would authenticate him and his mission, and on the other hand they had no ability to see and recognize the sign even when it was plainly before their eyes. Their utter unbelief grieved him to the heart. In verse 34 of the previous chapter, when he was confronted with human weakness and disability of a bodily sort, he sighed. Here confronted with blindness of a spiritual sort, he sighed deeply in his spirit. Spiritual incapacity is a far more serious matter than bodily incapacity. They were blind leaders of a blind generation and groping about for a sign. No sign would be given to them, for to blind men signs are useless. This was the occasion when, as recorded at the beginning of Matthew 16, the Lord told them they could discern the face of the sky, but not the signs of the times. Let us not dismiss this matter as being something which only concerns the Pharisee. In principle it also concerns ourselves. How often has the true believer been troubled and disheartened, thinking God has not spoken, or acted, or answered, when really he has, only we have not had eyes to see. We may have continued beseeching him for more light, when all the time all that was wanted was a few windows in our house. The motive actuating these Pharisees was wholly wrong, since their object was to tempt him. So the Lord abruptly left them and departed again to the other side of the lake, which he had left but a short time before, and the disciples were without bread. Thus for the third time they were face to face with the problem raised in the feeding of the 5,000 and the 4,000, only on a very small scale. Alas! The disciples no more met the problem in the strength of faith when it was on the small scale than when it was on the great scale. They too had not so far had eyes to see the power and glory of their Master, as displayed twice in his multiplication of the loaves and fishes. True faith has penetrating vision. They should have discerned who he was, and then they would have looked not to their paltry loaves or fishes but to him, and every difficulty would have vanished. In the small crises that mark our own lives, are we any better than they were? The Lord's charge about the leaven of the Pharisees and of Herod is not explained to us here, as it is in Matthew, but we must note its significance. He referred to the doctrine of the two factions, which worked like leaven in those who came under the influence of the one and the other. That of the Pharisees was hypocrisy. That of the Herodians was utter worldliness. In Matthew we read of the leaven of the Sadducees, and this was intellectual pride which led them into rationalistic unbelief. Nothing does more effectually blind the mind and understanding than leaven of these three kinds. The blind man of Bethsaida, of whom we read in verses 22 to 26, exactly illustrates the condition of the disciples at that time. When the blind man was brought to the Lord, he took him by the hand and led him out of the town, thus separating him from the haunts of men, just as previously he had turned his back upon the Pharisees and those with them. Verse 13. Outside the town the Lord dealt with him, performing his work in two parts, the only time, as far as we remember, that he acted thus. As the result of the first touch he saw men as trees, walking. He saw, but things were badly out of focus. He knew that the objects he saw were men, but they looked much bigger than they were. Thus it was with the disciples, man was too great in their eyes. Even as they looked at the Lord himself it would seem that his humanity eclipsed his deity in their eyes. They needed, like the blind man, a second touch before they saw all things clearly. The presence of the Son of God amongst them in flesh and blood was the first touch that reached them, and as a result they began to see. When he had died and risen again and was ascended to glory, he laid his second touch upon them in shedding forth his Spirit, as recorded in Acts 2. Then they saw all things clearly. We may well earnestly pray that our spiritual vision may not be nearsighted and out of focus, lest the great trees we think we see turn out to be merely feeble little men strutting about. Such a state is possible for us, as 2 Peter 1 verse 9 shows, and there is no excuse for us, since the Spirit has been given. The blind man, when cured, was not to go into the town nor testify to any in the town. Moreover, the Lord himself now withdrew with his disciples to Caesarea Philippi, the most northerly town within the confines of the land, and very near the Gentile border. Clearly he was beginning to withdraw himself and the testimony to his messiahship from the blind people and their yet more blinded leaders. Here he raised the question with his disciples as to who he was. The people hazarded differing guesses, but all imagined him to be some old prophet revived, just a man, and none had sufficient interest to really find out. Then Jesus challenged his disciples. Peter became the spokesman and answered, confessing his messiahship, but this only produced a rejoinder which probably astonished them greatly, and may astonish us as we read it today. He charged them to be silent as to his messiahship, and began to teach them as to his approaching rejection and death and resurrection. Any testimony that had been rendered to him as the Messiah on earth was now formally withdrawn. From this point he accepted his death as inevitable, and began to turn the thoughts of his disciples to that which was impending as the result of it. This was the orderly progress of things on the human side, and it does not contradict nor clash with the divine side that he knew from the outset that which was before him. Moreover, the disciples were as yet hardly fit to bear further testimony, had it been needed. Peter indeed had some measure of spiritual sight, for he had just confessed him as the Christ, yet the intimation of his approaching rejection and death raised a vehement remonstrance from this very man. In this Peter's mind was being swayed by Satan, and the Lord rebuked this spirit of evil who was behind Peter's words. Peter's mind was set on the things that be of men, and so he answered very aptly to the man of whom we have just read, who saw men as trees walking. Though he recognized the Christ in Jesus, he still had men before him, and in this the other disciples were no better than he. So how could he go forth as an effectual witness to the Christ whom he recognized? No wonder, after all, that at this point he charged his disciples that they should tell no man of him. We may pause here, each to face the fact that we cannot effectually go forth in testimony unless we really know the one of whom we testify, and also know and understand the situation that exists, in the face of which the testimony has to be rendered. In the closing verses of our chapter, the Lord begins to instruct his disciples in the presence of the people as to consequences that would follow from his rejection and death. They imagined themselves to be following a Messiah who was to be received and glorified on earth, and the fact was, he was about to die and rise again and be for the present glorified in heaven. This entailed an immense change in their outward prospects. It meant the denying of self, the taking up of the cross, the losing of life in this world, the bearing of shame as identified with Christ and his words, in the midst of an evil generation. The force of deny himself is hardly expressed by self-denial, which is the denying oneself of something. What the Lord speaks of is not that but the denial, or the saying of no, to oneself. Also, take up his cross does not mean bearing trials and troubles merely. The man who in those days took up his cross was being led to execution. He was a man who had to accept death at the hands of the world. To say no to oneself is to accept death internally, on one's own spirit. To take up one's cross is to accept death externally at the hands of the world. That is what discipleship must mean, since we follow the Christ who died, rejected of the world. This thought is expanded in verses 35 to 37. The true disciple of Christ is not aspiring to gain the whole world, he is ready rather to lose the world, and his own life in it, for the sake of the Lord and his gospel. The perfect servant, whom Mark depicts, gave his life that there might be a gospel to preach after. Those who follow him, and are his servants, must be prepared to give up their lives in preaching the gospel. If they should be ashamed of him now, he would be ashamed of them in the day of his glory.